The room smelled like money, not just the kind you earn, the kind you inherit. Old wood, starched linen, something floral that cost more per ounce than most people's grocery bills. The kind of smell that tells you before anyone opens their mouth exactly where you stand and where Elias Dowe stood, in the service corridor just off the main dining room of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, was nowhere they wanted to see him. He had a mop in his hand. He had gray in his beard. He had 61 years of living written in the lines around his eyes, and none of it, not one line, not 1 year, was visible to the people moving through those gilded doors. He was just the janitor. That was the beginning and the end of it, as far as anyone in that building was concerned. The Whitmore Grand sat at the edge of downtown like a monument to its own importance. 42 floors of marble and glass, a rooftop terrace that had hosted 3 governors and 1 sitting senator, a kitchen that held 2 James Beard nominations, and a reputation for discretion that money couldn't buy, though plenty of money had tried. Tonight was the Morrison Charity Gala, annual event, black tie, $500 a plate, with the proceeds going, theoretically, to after-school arts programs in the city's public schools. In practice, it was the one night a year when the city's wealthiest citizens got to feel good about themselves while eating duck confit and ignoring the people who set their tables. The ballroom was on the 3rd floor. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet tuning up in the corner, round tables draped in ivory linen, each one holding a small fortune in centerpieces, and at the far end of the room near the east wall, a Steinway Model D concert grand, black, polished to a mirror finish. 9 feet of German craftsmanship sitting there like something sacred, which, to anyone who actually understood what they were looking at, it was. Elias Dowe understood exactly what he was looking at. He had been looking at pianos like that one for 50 years. He didn't linger. That was the first rule of this kind of work. You didn't linger anywhere that wasn't yours. You moved through spaces like water moves through a room. Present, functional, then gone. You didn't make eye contact. You didn't speak unless spoken to. You carried your mop and your bucket and your invisibility like equipment, because that's what they were. Elias had learned that a long time ago. Not from bitterness, just from reality. He'd spent the better part of the afternoon on the 3rd floor, polishing the service hallways, touching up the baseboards near the ballroom entrance, making sure the supply closet near the east stairwell was properly stocked. His supervisor, a younger man named Bryce, who communicated primarily in clipped sentences and clipboard taps, had handed him the floor assignment at 2 in the afternoon without looking up. 3rd floor. Full service prep. Ballroom access closes at 6. It was now 5:40. Elias pushed his cart past the propped ballroom doors, meaning only to check the supply closet at the far end of the hall. The event staff was still arranging tables. The caterers were moving through with covered trays. No one paid him any attention. He was almost past when he heard it. A note. One note struck by someone testing the piano's upper register. A single high C, clean and precise. Elias stopped walking. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the cart. The note had already dissolved into the ambient noise of the room, clinking glasses, murmured instructions, the distant scrape of chairs. No one else had even noticed it. But Elias had heard it the way you hear your own name called in a crowd, involuntarily, completely. He told himself to keep moving. He did not keep moving. The piano was unoccupied. The tuner, whoever had struck that note, had already moved on. The ballroom staff were clustered near the entrance, checking something on a tablet. The quartet was still in the corner, 3 of them talking while the violinist quietly worked through a passage. Elias set his cart near the wall. He walked to the piano the way you walk towards something you used to love, before life redirected you, carefully, like the distance was something to be respected. He sat down on the bench. He didn't touch the keys right away. He just sat, looked at his hands. The left one, with the slightly crooked ring finger he'd jammed badly in '94 and never had properly set. The right one, with the old calluses along the fingertips that hadn't fully faded even after years away from serious practice. They were a working man's hands now, scarred from cleaning chemicals, rough at the knuckles, not the hands of anyone who belonged near an instrument like this, but muscle memory doesn't check credentials. His right hand moved to the keys before he'd consciously decided to let it. Just the opening phrase of something he'd played 10,000 times. An old Thelonious Monk piece, gentle and searching. 4 bars, barely above a whisper. He stopped. The room hadn't changed. Nobody had turned around. His hands remembered everything. Hey! The voice came from his left, sharp, flat, the kind of voice that doesn't ask, it issues. Elias looked up. The man standing at the edge of the piano was somewhere in his mid-50s, silver-haired, wearing a tuxedo that fit the way tuxedos fit when they're custom-made rather than rented. His face held the particular expression of a man who had not waited for anything in a very long time and had no intention of starting now. His name was Caldwell Prentiss. Most people in this city knew that name. Prentiss Capital. Commercial real estate. 3 downtown towers and a controlling stake in 2 regional hotel chains, one of which, and this was the relevant detail, had recently acquired the Whitmore Grand. In other words, Caldwell Prentiss didn't just attend this gala. He owned the building it was held in. Elias looked at him calmly. "Evening, sir. What do you think you're doing?" "I was just—" "Get up." There was no particular heat in the words. That was the thing about men like Caldwell Prentiss. They didn't need heat. The temperature of the room adjusted to them, not the other way around. Elias stood. "This isn't for you," Prentiss said. He said it the way you tell a dog to get off the furniture. Matter of fact. Not cruel exactly. Cruelty implies some acknowledgement of the other person's interior life. This was something more absolute than cruelty. It was erasure. "I understand," Elias said. "Do you?" It wasn't a question. "I've got a concert pianist flying in from Atlanta tonight. This instrument was tuned this morning. I don't need." He paused, and in that pause he looked at Elias's hands, at the uniform, at the cart against the wall, whatever that was. Elias nodded once. He stepped away from the bench. He should have left it there. He should have collected his cart and moved to the supply closet and finished his shift and gone home. That would have been the reasonable thing to do, the safe thing, the invisible thing. But something in him, something old and stubborn and not quite dead yet, said 3 words before he could stop them. "It was Monk, sir." Prentiss turned back. "Excuse me?" "What I was playing. Round midnight. Thelonious Monk." The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that happens when someone has said something that doesn't compute. Prentiss looked at Elias the way you look at a piece of furniture that has spoken. "I know what Monk is," he said very quietly. "Then you know it's worth playing on an instrument like this." Something shifted in Prentiss's expression. Not anger, not yet. Something more like disbelief that had started curdling at the edges. "You need to leave this room," he said. And then, because the universe has a particular sense of timing, 4 things happened in rapid succession. The string quartet stopped talking and began to play. A group of early arriving guests entered through the main doors. Marjorie Wills, the Whitmore Grand's director of events, a small, precise woman with 23 years in hotel management, and a reputation for handling exactly this kind of situation, appeared at Prentiss's elbow. And Caldwell Prentiss put his hand on Elias Dowe's shoulder and pushed. Not a shove, not a full push, but a deliberate, dismissive. "This is how I end conversations" motion that sent Elias half a step sideways and knocked his shoulder into the edge of the piano bench. The bench scraped. The sound cut through the string quartet's opening phrase. Everyone near them turned. "Caldwell." Marjorie Wills's voice was perfectly level. The voice of someone who has managed crises for 2 decades. "Why don't we get you a drink before the other guests arrive?" Prentiss didn't look at her. He was still looking at Elias. "Get him out of here," he said. Elias stood in the service corridor. His shoulder didn't hurt. He'd been knocked harder by supply carts over the years, and the physical part of what had just happened was already receding into the background noise of his body's accumulated history. What remained was something quieter and more familiar, a particular heaviness. The kind you carry when you've spent your life being told in 1,000 different languages that you don't belong in the room. He leaned against the wall. From inside the ballroom, he could hear the string quartet, the growing murmur of arriving guests, the clink of champagne flutes. He could hear Marjorie Wills's heels on the marble floor, moving with purpose. He could hear, very faintly, someone saying Prentiss's name in the warm, welcoming tone people use when they want something from powerful men. Elias closed his eyes. He thought about the first time he had ever sat at a concert grand. He'd been 11 years old. His mother, who cleaned offices in the Garfield building downtown 6 days a week, had taken him on a Saturday afternoon to watch a recital at the City Arts Center. The kind of free community event that nobody important attended, and everybody who mattered to Elias attended. A man named Howard Duckett, who taught piano at the community center and wore the same brown corduroy jacket every time Elias saw him, had sat down at a Steinway that dwarfed the small stage and played Chopin until 3 people in the front row cried. Elias had not cried. He had sat very still and thought, I need to learn how to do that. He took his first lesson 6 weeks later. He took his last professional stage appearance 31 years ago at Carnegie Hall at the age of 30. The 24 years between those two dates contained more than most people accumulate in a lifetime. The Juilliard scholarship he'd won at 17, the professors who'd fought over him. The career that had begun with such velocity that people around him used the word inevitable the way they talk about weather. The recording contracts, the tours, the 3 albums that had earned him 2 Grammy nominations, and the respective musicians who had been playing since before he was born. And then the accident. Not dramatic, not a car crash or a stage collapse or any of the things that make for a tidy narrative. A fall. A wet sidewalk, a November morning in 1997, his right hand going out to break his fall, and the sound, the specific, irreversible sound, of 3 bones in his wrist breaking in ways that orthopedic surgeons later told him, with genuine regret, that they could not fully repair. He had tried, Lord knows he had tried. 2 surgeries, 3 years of physical therapy, hours and hours of slow, grinding exercises designed to rebuild what the pavement had taken. He had gotten back perhaps 70% of what he'd had. For most people, 70% of Elias Dowe's technical ability would have been more than sufficient. For Elias Dowe, it was not enough to play the way Elias Dowe needed to play. He'd made his peace with it, eventually. Not quickly and not without cost. There were years in there that he didn't look at too closely. Years involving whiskey and silence and a small apartment with the blinds down. But eventually, yes, he had made his peace. He'd taken the hotel job 7 years ago after his mother got sick, and he'd come back to the city to help with her care. It paid steadily. It asked nothing of him except his presence and his effort. And sometimes, when the hallways were empty and his shift was almost over, he would pass the piano in the lobby bar. A modest upright, nothing like the Steinway in that ballroom, and he would sit for a few minutes and play, just for himself, just to remember what his hands still knew. Mr. Dowe. He opened his eyes. Marjorie Wills was standing in the corridor entrance. The efficiency was still there in her posture, but something else was in her face now. Not quite discomfort, but its close relative. I'm sorry about what happened in there, she said. It's all right. It isn't. She said it simply, without flourish. I wanted you to know that. Elias nodded. He appreciated the honesty. Most people in situations like this went straight to explaining why the thing that had happened had been unavoidable, which was its own kind of insult. The concert pianist, he said, from Atlanta. Wills hesitated. He called 20 minutes ago, she said. Flight delay. He won't arrive until 9 at the earliest. The program was supposed to start at 7:30. Elias looked at her. I don't have anyone else, Wills said. I've called 4 people on a Friday night in the middle of gala season. She paused. The quartet can cover some of it, but the centerpiece of the program was always the solo piano. Mr. Prentiss specifically requested it. I know, Elias said. I watched you from the doorway, Wills said. Before Mr. Prentiss came in, I heard what you were playing. The corridor was quiet. What do you need from me? Elias said. Marjorie Wills was not a woman who did things without thinking them through. It was why she'd survived 23 years in a business where most people burned out in 5. She was practical, precise, and, though she would not have used this word about herself, brave in the specific way that hotel directors have to be brave, willing to make the call, absorb the consequences, and keep the evening moving. She had made her calculation. She had noted what she'd heard through the ballroom door. She had remembered something she'd once come across in the hotel's records. A background file for long-term staff, the kind with a brief employment history that nobody ever actually reads. She had made her call. She went back into the ballroom. Caldwell Prentiss was near the bar holding a glass of scotch and talking at 2 men who were nodding with the practiced attentiveness of people who needed something from him. He looked up when Wills approached. Is he gone? Mr. Prentiss? Wills said, I have a situation. Donovan is delayed. Prentiss's expression shifted. What do you mean, delayed? Flight out of Atlanta is backed up. He won't be here until 9. I have 200 guests arriving in the next 45 minutes and no pianist for the program. Prentiss set down his glass. That's your problem to solve. I've solved it, Wills said. I wanted you to know before we proceed. Who? Marjorie Wills told him. The silence that followed was educational. Absolutely not, Prentiss said. The alternative is asking the quartet to cover the full evening, which they aren't prepared for, or announcing to your guests that the centerpiece of the program won't happen. Find someone else. I've made 8 calls. Then make 8 more. Mr. Prentiss. Wills kept her voice level. The gala starts in 47 minutes. I have a solution. It's standing in the service corridor. And with respect, given what happened earlier, I think it would be in everyone's interest to let me proceed. The 2 men near Prentiss had gone very quiet. They were looking at their shoes with great concentration. Prentiss looked at Wills for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, the calculation of a man who understood optics, who knew that 200 people were about to walk into his building and that a failed gala reflecting poorly on his charitable foundation was a different kind of problem than a janitor on a piano bench. Fine, he said, but he changes first. They found a tuxedo in the event storage, one of the spares kept for exactly this kind of emergency, a size 42 long that fit Elias as though it had been waiting for him. One of the younger event staff, a 22-year-old named Darius, who had been watching all of this unfold with barely concealed astonishment, helped with the cufflinks. "You're really gonna play?" Darius said. "That's the plan," Elias said. "You play professionally?" Elias looked at himself in the small mirror on the storage room wall, the tuxedo, the gray in his beard, the hands at his sides that still remembered everything. "I used to," he said. The guests didn't know. That was the thing. 200 people in evening wear took their seats around those ivory-draped tables, accepted their champagne, made their small talk, and watched a man in a tuxedo walk to the Steinway with the quiet composure of someone who had done this many times before, which he had, without any idea who they were watching. They saw a man they didn't recognize. They thought he was the pianist from Atlanta. Caldwell Prentiss stood near the back wall, with his arms crossed, jaw set, watching with the expression of a man who had been maneuvered into something and hadn't yet decided how he felt about it. Elias sat down at the Steinway. He adjusted the bench. He set his hands in his lap for just a moment, not from nerves, but from something older and more deliberate, a kind of acknowledgement. The way you take a breath before stepping into water. Then he began to play. He started with Bach. Not as a warm-up, as a statement. The prelude in C major from the well-tempered clavier, deceptively simple, structurally perfect, the kind of piece that sounds easy and isn't, that sounds we're familiar, and keeps revealing itself. He played it at a tempo that was slower than most pianists take it, letting every note exist fully before the next one arrived. The room quieted. Not all at once. It took maybe 30 seconds. People finished their sentences. They put down their forks. They turned toward the piano. Not because someone told them to, but because the room had reorganized itself around what was coming from that instrument, the way a room reorganizes around a fire. Elias moved from Bach to Ravel. The pavane pour un enfant défunt. The pavane for a dead princess, a piece of such enormous, aching beauty that it made the chandeliers seem insufficient for what they were illuminating. He played it with his eyes open, watching the keys, watching his hands. They moved the way they'd always moved. Differently than they had before the injury, yes. There were compensations he'd developed over years, slight adjustments in position and weight distribution that had become second nature. But the music came through, all of it. The music always came through. Somewhere around the 3rd minute of the Ravel, a woman at a table near the front touched her husband's arm without looking away from the piano. Caldwell Prentiss had uncrossed his arms. Elias played for 45 minutes. Bach, Ravel. A long middle section that moved from Monk to Bill Evans to something that was purely Elias. An improvisation that built on what came before it, that took the room somewhere unexpected and then brought it back, gently, like a guide who knows the terrain. He played the injury into the music. He played the empty apartment and the years with the blinds down and his mother's face in the hospital and the November sidewalk and everything before and after it. Not because the audience needed to know any of that, but because that's what music is for. Because the only way to get what happened to him into sound was to play it. And the only way to play it was to mean it. The room was completely still. Marjorie Wills stood at the back, near the service entrance, and let herself breathe for the first time since 5:40. Young Darius, who was supposed to be managing the appetizer service, had stopped moving entirely and was standing against the wall with his hands at his sides and an expression on his face that he would remember for the rest of his life. At the table nearest the piano, a woman named Carolyn Ash, 60 years old, retired federal judge, the kind of woman who did not cry in public as a matter of long personal policy, had tears running down her face that she was not bothering to wipe away. Elias ended with Chopin, the Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. The most played Chopin nocturne in history, the one that gets called overexposed because people think familiarity is the same thing as diminishment. It isn't. Under the right hands, on the right night, it still does what Chopin intended it to do. It opens something in the chest that you didn't know was closed. The final notes faded. The room held its silence for 2 full seconds. The best kind of silence, the kind that means no one wanted to be the one to break it. And then the applause started. Caldwell Prentiss began to clap with everyone else. He did it automatically, before he'd consciously decided to, the way people sometimes reach out to catch something falling before their brain has processed what's happening. His hands were moving before he stopped them, and by then it was too late, because the 2 men beside him were already clapping, and the table nearest him was already on their feet, and the wave of it was moving through the room. He clapped 4 times. Then he stopped. He looked at the man at the piano. Elias Dowe stood. He turned to face the room. He acknowledged the applause with a single nod, not a bow, because Elias Dowe had never been a bower, just a nod, calm, direct, the nod of a man who is completely clear about where he stands. The standing ovation reached the back of the room. Marjorie Wills reached the piano first. She leaned toward him and said something that the room couldn't hear. Elias responded. Whatever she said, whatever he said, his expression didn't change much, just a slight softening at the corners of his eyes. Then she turned to face the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wills said in the carrying, practiced voice of someone who had addressed rooms like this one many times, "I want to introduce you to the musician who has just given us that performance. His name is Elias Dowe." The applause didn't die down. If anything, it strengthened. Mr. Dowe has worked at the Whitmore Grand for 7 years. Before that, he was a concert pianist with a career that included 2 Grammy nominations, recordings released on Blue Note and Verve, and performances at Carnegie Hall, the Kennedy Center, the Barbican in London, and the Sydney Opera House. A different kind of quiet now, the kind that comes with recalibration. He performed for 2 sitting presidents at White House state dinners, Wills continued, and was scheduled to perform for a 3rd before an injury in 1997 ended his professional career. He has not performed publicly since that year. She paused. Until tonight. The room processed this. Caldwell Prentiss stood very still. Someone near the front said, not quietly, "He's the janitor." And someone else said, even less quietly, "He was never the janitor." The thing about a room full of wealthy people is that they understand very quickly when they are in the presence of something that has value. They had not known what they were watching. Now they did. And the recalibration that happened in the next 30 seconds was the kind that moves from face to face like weather. The judge, Carolyn Ash, was already on her feet again. Others followed. Elias stood at the Steinway and accepted it. Not with the performance of humility, the hand on the chest, the overwhelmed gesture, but with genuine stillness. With the quiet of a man who had lived through enough that he knew how to hold something good when it came. He looked once toward the back of the room. Caldwell Prentiss was already moving toward the exit. Later, after the gala, after the last guests had lingered far longer than planned, after 3 people had given Marjorie Wills their cards and asked, in voices that meant they were serious, how to reach Elias Dowe about future performances. Elias sat in the break room on the 2nd floor in his work clothes again, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He was looking at his hands. Darius came in to collect a supply order and stopped when he saw him. "You good?" Darius said. Elias considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." Darius nodded. He was 22 and he had watched a 61-year-old man in a janitor's uniform become someone else in front of 200 people. Or maybe, more accurately, he had watched the world remember who a man had always been. "That last piece," Darius said. "The slow one. What was that?" "Choppin'," Elias said, "Nocturne in E-flat." It sounded like, Darius searched for the right word. It sounded like something you'd hear at the end of something, you know? Like something finally finishing. Elias looked up at him. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly right." The calls started the following Monday. Not because Marjorie Wills had orchestrated anything, though she had given his name to everyone who asked, but because 2 of the guests from that evening One a music producer who'd had 4 Grammys of his own, one a journalist for a national publication who'd been at the gala as a +1 and had enough sense to start recording discreetly about 30 seconds into the revel, had told people. And those people had told people. By Wednesday, there was an interview request from a music magazine that Elias had read cover to cover every month for 30 years. By Friday, there was a message forwarded through Wills from a concert hall in Chicago about a possible engagement. Elias did not quit the Whitmore Grand immediately. That wasn't who he was. He gave 30 days' notice, worked his full shifts, finished what he'd started. Bryce, his supervisor with the clipboard, found out what had happened from someone on the events staff and spent the better part of a Tuesday morning looking at Elias differently and not quite knowing what to do with it. "You really played for the president?" Bryce said finally. "Presidents," Elias said. "Twice. Different ones." Bryce nodded slowly. "Ha," he said. It was, in its way, the most honest response Elias received from anyone that week. The article came out in November. The journalist had done her research. The title was something Elias had not chosen and would not have chosen, but he understood why they'd written it. There was a photograph, not from the gala, but an old one from 1993, a 24-year-old Elias Dowe at a Steinway in Carnegie Hall, leaning slightly forward over the keys the way he did when the music took him somewhere. The caption under the photograph said, "He never stopped being this." He read the article once. He put the magazine on the table in his apartment, not in a drawer, not tucked away, but on the table where he could see it when he came home. Then he sat down at the upright piano he'd had in that apartment for 11 years and played for 3 hours straight, not because anyone was listening, not for any audience, not for Carnegie Hall or the Kennedy Center, or even for the memory of Howard Duckett in his brown corduroy jacket. Just because the music was there, it had always been there. All it had ever needed was a room willing to listen.